Christianity and Liberalism, the path of salvation and the path of negation. The title of this presentation is taken from Gresham Machen's 1923 book, Christianity and Liberalism. In it, he identifies liberalism as a religion, one which is completely antithetical to Christianity. For Machen, a seminal theologian in 20th century evangelicalism, there can be no synthesis between the two groups. Quote, "At every point, the two movements are in direct opposition." This presentation gives an overview of some of the thinkers and ideas behind the two movements. It will take in ideologies such as Marxism, neo-Marxism, and modern social justice activism. Machen uses the term liberalism to denote a humanistic left-wing progressive ideology, seeking an alternative future free from the shackles of tradition. Today, well-known movements such as Black Lives Matter and Gay Pride are representative of liberalism. The terms leftism and progressivism are also used as synonyms for liberalism. Machen's Christianity is American conservative Christianity, which seeks to conserve the nation's religious traditions in the face of liberalisation. They see themselves defending the promised land of their forebears, the English pilgrims and founding fathers who established their biblically inspired city upon a hill with a written declaration recognising God as the creator and source of human rights. Machen presented Christianity versus liberalism as a zero-sum game between antithetical worldviews competing for the soul of America. The conservative side of America is rooted in a British, essentially English, religious, political and cultural source. The liberal side, on the other hand, is influenced by continental Europe, particularly in the form of German and French thought. The 20th century battle between Christianity and liberalism reflects an ongoing paradigm of Enlightenment conflict between faith and reason. Machen's school of theology expresses a set of presuppositions that splits people into two categories: believers and unbelievers. Each and every human being either believes there is a God or believes there is not a God. It is a categorical social divide of the most profound significance. Before mapping Christianity and liberalism onto these binary categories, I should briefly recap the structure of this triangular model of reality. It is based on the first verse of the Bible, which reads, quote, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth," unquote. So we begin with God at the peak, then his creation of heaven and earth. This begins a binary pattern in creation. The heavenly and earthly realms can be thought of in terms of spiritual and material, or natural and supernatural. Then there is the creation of man, created in God's image. Beings that are a unique synthesis of spirit and matter. From this initial synthesis, society can be separated into two groups, two positions that either pertain towards the spiritual or towards the material, towards heavenly things or towards earthly things. This theosocial binary has biblical grounds. In the Gospel of Matthew, for instance, Jesus separates the saved from the damned as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. There are no intermediate categories. Machen maps this theological binary onto Christianity and liberalism, claiming that liberalism is underpinned by skepticism about God, in its strongest form, atheism, denying the existence of God. Before understanding the role of atheism, we should recall the Christian position. Its primary presupposition in relation to atheism is that God exists. He is the absolute source of all existence. Christianity is in this sense foundationally conservative. The believer looks back to the cause of existence. Atheism, in its negation of God, presents a godless account of creation, proceeding from nothing to matter. Because of this atheist presupposition, atheism is foundationally progressive. Having accepted the premise that matter popped into existence, a pattern for automatic improvement is set. For instance, the notion that human beings evolved from lower life forms flows naturally. Progressive principles suggest that life develops naturally from primitivism towards perfection. This runs counter to the biblical notion of life being created perfect, but falling into corruption through human disobedience to God's will. Machen was embroiled in the early 20th century battle between evolutionary and biblical creation accounts. Conflict erupted publicly in the Scopes Monkey trial of 1925, a courtroom battle framed as conflict between fundamentalists and modernists. It was one of many historic legal battles to come. In the preceding century, Ludwig Feuerbach, a German left-wing Hegelian thinker, reversed the order of creation in Genesis, so that man created God in his own image. That is to say, our superstitious ancestors projected an image of God from their own consciousness. Feuerbach demonstrates the leftist critical method of subverting tradition, taking the biblical account and turning it upside down. In the atheist subversion of biblical creation, man is the measure of all things, the peak of creation. In Feuerbach's framing, the spiritual realm is analogous with the mind. Man is the synthesis of thought and matter, the rational animal. In Christianity, God's mind gives rise to the human mind, but in atheism, non-mind gives rise to mind. Again, we have something from nothing. An existentialist approach is instructive in looking at how believers and unbelievers view themselves. Existentialist philosophers were concerned with what it means to exist. What is the self? They claimed the hierarchy of the self, seeking the source of being. Concentric circles provide a useful way of modelling this, with centrality denoting eminence. The inner quest of Christian existentialist Søren Kierkegaard affected a leap of faith to God. This is in keeping with the image of God doctrine in Genesis 1. This existentialist microcosmic model of being echoes the macrocosmic pattern of creation, with God at the centre, his creative acts expanding outward through heaven and earth. Kierkegaard appreciated the dialectical nature of man. Quote, "Every human being is the synthesis of spirit and body, the infinite and finite, freedom and necessity, destined for spirit." Unquote. Through Christ, the believer is reunited with God and the blessed assurance of eternal life. The atheist existentialist, on the other hand, having negated God, seeks the core of the self by himself and finds death. Liberal atheist existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, who described eternal life as an illusion, searched for the meaning of being and found the horrors of nothingness. Quote, "Nothingness lies coiled in the heart of being like a worm." Unquote. Existentialism cultivated a fascination with death and meaninglessness. There is biblical precedence for this in Genesis 3. The fall of man demonstrates that when humans turn from God, death follows. Nietzsche proclaimed at the start of the 20th century that God is dead, and Sartre's post-war existential philosophy suggests the death of God brought death to the self. Now, existentialism, although centred on the individual, is relevant when scaled up to the social level. It is certainly relevant to the liberals, who believe that the personal is political, as their slogan goes, that individual identities are formed by social structures. It was relevant to Sartre, who preached a radical liberalism. For him, the ideology of existence was an enclave of Marxism, which he hailed as, quote, the one philosophy of our time that we cannot go beyond, unquote. As Sartre's existentialism brought death to the individual, the Marxist ideology he followed brought death to the nations. Marxism. Before delving into the socio-political concerns of Marx, we should first recollect the biblical understanding of the social. God's society is represented here in its pre-fall perfect form. Angelic beings and human beings, male and female, lived in harmony. Eden gives humanity its utopian urge, a desire for paradise. Conservatives venerate the Eden of the past, while progressives reimagine a new Eden for the future. Marxism replaces God with its own material deity. Here, in this sociological framing of the materialist realm, I suggest society as the God of Marxism. Eminent sociologist Emile Durkheim said, quote, society is God, unquote, suggesting that the idea of God is the projection of a society's own values, idealised in a transcendent form. This reads like a socialised version of Feuerbach's God as a projection of the human mind. Society is God for leftists. They are truly socialists, a collective tribe who worship an idealised vision of society. Marx's materialism both imitates and inverts the higher order pattern of dialectical theism. In Marx's analysis, man is not alienated from God, but from material objects by an oppressive social hierarchy. The result for society is a binary struggle between the oppressor class and the oppressed class. Like his contemporary Feuerbach, Marx was a left-wing Hegelian. Hegel taught that history unfolds dialectically through a series of conflicts between rival ideas. Each historical age is marked by a new idea, a synthesis of previous antagonisms. This synthesis is followed by an antithetical idea, and the dialectical process continues through the ages of history until all the contradictions have been resolved. In Marx's dialectical materialism, history unfolds progressively through a series of ages as the oppressed and the oppressor battle across time. Each societal conflict marks an ascension on the rungs of a historical ladder, with humanity rising from primitivism through slavery and feudalism to Marx's own age of capitalism. The resolution to conflict was the proposed future ages of socialism and ultimately communism, when all people would live in a paradise of total equality without God. A key feature in Marx's oppressor-oppressed dialectic is power. The language of power and the study of its dynamics becomes characteristic of the left. For Christians, all power belongs to God, to the One. In Marxism's inversion, power belongs to society, to the many. The war cry is power to the people, a direct overturning of the biblical order. That power in the materialist mind does not come from God means that, like all resources, it is limited. So it must be taken away from the oppressors. Two key features of Marxist thought are worth considering. Firstly, its commitment to putting theory into practice. A philosophy epitomised in the quotation at the base of Marx's gravestone, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it," unquote. It is an exhortation for Marxists to actively change the world. The statement signals a division in intellectual theories running along the conservative versus liberal axis. Traditional theorists are descriptive. They attempt to understand the world, whereas critical theories are prescriptive. They must conquer the world. Critical theorists call this activist philosophy praxis, essentially putting theory into practice. If praxis denotes the insatiable will of Marxists to revolutionise society, then the second feature denotes the range of the revolution. This is Marx's call to critique everything that exists. Consequently, critical theories have spread into every conceivable domain. Looking through critical lenses, they find conflict wherever they look. For this reason, they are also called conflict theories. And it should be understood that conflict theories are drivers of conflict. The clue is in the name. Conflict theories need conflict to function, in the same way that a diesel engine needs diesel to function. Conflict is their fuel. Where there is no discernible injustice, liberalism mines deeper and deeper to find it. Where there is no obvious discrimination, there must be systemic discrimination. If there is no actual aggression, there are microaggressions. No actual bias, there is unconscious bias. It is an irony, or perhaps a double standard, that conflict theorists criticise everything that exists, except, of course, their own theories. They delight in looking through lenses, but never look in the mirror. At this venture, it would be useful to appreciate the finitude of materialism. Marxists believe there is a limit to the number of conflicts in history. The communist utopia arrives when all the dialectical contradictions have been completed. This means that each conflict society suffers is a step closer to utopia. And tantalisingly, the next conflict could be the last. It could be the consummation of history. The justification for conflict is always injustice. The ubiquitous chant of "no justice, no peace" is described by conservative commentator Thomas Sowell as a terrifying recipe for endless conflict. For wherever there are groups of humans, there will be disparity of some form or other. The notion that conflict is limited means that no matter the horrific personal and societal cost, it is, in a sense, always a positive step, always a step closer. Chairman Mao, the Chinese Marxist leader, reckoned that perhaps 2/3 of the world's population would need to be exterminated to initiate the communist utopia. The proportions are truly biblical. In fact, twice that of the 1/3 wiped out in the book of Revelation. There is a key difference, though, between the Christian and Marxist end times predictions. In Christianity, it is God, the sovereign creator, who reaches into history at his own discretion, regardless of human will. Whereas in Marxism and the left in general, there is no external authority. It is the people who must see through the conflict to bring about utopia. Through Marx's economic lens, Christianity is equated with monarchy and wealth. This developed liberal Enlightenment thought linking Christianity with conservatism. In the century before Marx, liberal thinkers such as Rousseau sought to free the oppressed from their chains, inspiring French revolutionaries in their horrific orgy of violence. They vowed to, quote, strangle the last king with the entrails of the last priest. A ghastly image of fanatical materialism, elbow deep in the guts of the enemy. Marxism promises the abolition of hierarchy, but of course, hierarchy is hardwired into the structure of the created order. The pattern is established regardless of its denial. In short, hierarchy will form. Those who claim they will abolish hierarchy are the new hierarchy. In the book of Genesis, the serpent promises that by breaking away from God's word, humans would become like gods themselves. Instead, they encountered alienation and death. The pattern is set. Humans turn from God and become gods unto themselves. We cannot help but place something or someone above us, raising the fists, flags, and messiahs of our highest principles. In the mid-20th century, popular preachers such as Billy Graham warned Americans that they would have to choose between Christ or Marx. In the 1970s, evangelical theologian Francis Schaeffer, considered by many to be the primary intellectual force behind today's politically engaged evangelicals, echoed his teacher Gresham Machen in warning that there could be no synthesis between Christianity and Marxism. Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto, published in 1981, explained that America's historic belief in God, what he called the Christian consensus, was the glue that held America together, the chief factor in its unity. Without God, the unity would dissolve in an age of fragmentation. Without its transcendent biblical laws, humanity would sink into a swamp of relativism, scrambling to find meaning and morality in the quicksands of competing ideas. Just looking at the art of the 20th century reflects the fragmentation of meaning and loss of purpose in society. Fragmentation was hastened by postmodernism, a Marxist-infused project developing in the 1960s and 70s that suggested that reality cannot be known, only constructed out of language. This marks another development of Feuerbach's projection idea. First, God is seen as a projection of the human mind, followed by creation as a projection of the human mind. The notion that humans create reality through language is a materialist reinterpretation of the biblical God who speaks reality into existence. He says, for instance, "Let there be light," and there was light. Postmodernist icons such as Michel Foucault, pictured here with Sartre, reduced knowledge and language to power, urging the oppressed to rise up against the traditional narratives of the oppressor. America's theistic unity can be dissolved by a materialist creed of diversity, with phrases such as "diversity is our strength" becoming axiomatic in liberalizing society. This tenuous promise of inclusivity and diversity, however, excludes conservatives and Christians, and any others that do not ascribe to leftist dogma. The social God is a jealous God. It demands complete devotion. Neo-Marxism. Over the course of the 20th century, As it became clear that Karl Marx's economic analysis was lacking, Marxism took a cultural turn, developing into neo-Marxism. Key thinkers of the Frankfurt School and Italian communist leader Antonio Gramsci recognised that Marxism, if it was to succeed, had to move on from overturning the economy to overturning the whole culture. Gramsci spoke of cultural hegemony, basically the power of the ideas behind culture. He urged a long march through the institutions, overturning tradition with ideology in the culture-producing centres of society: church, family, community, education, entertainment, business, government. Power, and the abuse of power in the form of discrimination, is viewed as systemic. That is to say, it permeates everything. It is a political version of the theological notion of sin in the world. For neo-Marxists, discrimination is baked into culture by the oppressor class. They are to blame. Only revolution can rid the world of the horrors of systemic discrimination. The intellectual elites of liberalism drip feed these terms down into the culture until it becomes the language of the streets, as part of the vast rewriting of the American story. Ignoring the intrinsic values established by the biblical image of God doctrine, neo-Marxists bound human rights to a range of extrinsic material properties. Identity politics developed as a creed, with race, gender, and sexuality featuring as the holy trinity of liberal identitarianism. It is worth adding at this juncture that Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theories were grafted into the movement, inflating its deification of sexuality, using permissiveness to contradict the Christian virtue of chastity. For power to be given to oppressed minority groups, it must be taken away from oppressor majority groups, with white, male, heterosexism representing the oppressors in chief. According to critical theorists, white men did not build the institutions of Western civilization through competence and goodwill, but through power abuse and discrimination. Francis Schaeffer warned the late 20th century that turning from God towards liberalism would bring death to America. Schaeffer drew a direct line from the acceptance of evolution in the 1920s to the acceptance of abortion in the 1970s. Once the child in the womb went from being an eternal soul made in the image of God to an accidental collection of molecules evolved from lower life forms, the decision to end the lives of millions of children came easily. Schaeffer taught that Christianity had a high view of human life, while liberalism has a low view, with abortion serving as a prime example. He classed Marxism as a Christian heresy. One reason behind this being that Marxism, indeed the left in general, inherited the notion of human rights from the Christian image of God doctrine. The sacredness of human life was not a product of the pagan world. Abortion rights became the purview of feminism and a frontline issue in the culture wars between Christianity and liberalism. Returning to a traditional biblical model of society allows us to recap some of the main features that liberalism seeks to contradict. From the oneness of God interacting with his creation, a binary pattern emerges. Dualities proceed through the works of creation. The separation of heaven and earth, light and darkness, male and female, and so on. Liberalism opposes these traditional binaries. Atheism's denial of the foundational binary between heaven and earth sets a pattern of denial for subsequent binaries. Most controversially in today's culture wars is the denial of the sex or gender binary. Liberal theories propose that the notion of the gender binary is another construction of language rather than a biological statement of fact. They deconstruct the binary and reconstruct a gender spectrum with a variety of positions, and through word power they become whichever identity they identify with. They are socially constructed beings. The theological basis for the divine sacredness of life is replaced with a sociological sacredness. The liberal notion, I am who I say I am, is an empowering humanist appropriation of God's statement of identity to Moses in Exodus 3, I am who I am. Again, they have become as gods. In the liberal revolution, everything formerly considered a vice is made a virtue and vice versa. Everything is overturned. If society was patriarchal, it must be made matriarchal. The heterosexual made homosexual, and the monoculture broken down by multiculturalism. Criticising everything that exists until every contradiction has been worked through. In Machen's time, in the 1920s, liberalism pushed materialist cosmology into schools. By the 2020s, it pushes materialist ideologies into the schools. Part of its unremitting drive to put marginalised minorities into the centre of society. Where Christian society put God at the centre, liberalism pushes him to the margins. Where Christianity put the dark and demonic at the margins, liberalism brings it into the centre. There has been a move by mainstream denominations to synthesise Christianity and liberalism into a sort of liberal Christianity. Unbiblical innovations such as same-sex marriage and gay clergy are the fruits of progressive Christianity. There is a liberal argument that Marxist principles were evident in the early church. The equal sharing of wealth among the Christian community is seen as a communistic endeavour. The problem is that Marxism and liberalism more broadly seek equality without God. As we have seen, God is replaced by society. The human is made in the image of society rather than the image of God. From the conservative perspective, liberal churches merely function like a social weather vane, pointing in whichever direction the winds of public opinion blow. For Machen and Schaeffer, there can be no synthesis. The two worldviews and the results they produce are completely antithetical. This is apparent wherever strong forms of Christianity and liberalism collide. How justified is Machen's contention that liberalism is a religion? Well, the core components of a religion are observable. I will run through a few immediately apparent features. Beginning by thinking about how Christians look upwards to God as the divine source of all things. We have saw that liberalism also looks upwards to its own transcendent principles. Scholars suggest that humans have an inbuilt need for religion, and where the existing religion has been pushed away, a new religion fills the vacuum. When Nietzsche wrote, "God is dead," he added that there might be caves in the future where religion persists. Liberalism, in its hollowing out of Christian tradition, may have carved out such a cave for itself. Despite its materialist declarations, liberalism sets up a higher metaphysical structure akin to the supernatural pattern of Christianity, ascending upwards towards the Almighty. Liberalism's view of reality is as totalizing and moralistic as any religion, constructing doctrinal systems of morals and meanings, unified in the worship of symbols. Both Christianity and liberalism split the world into believers and unbelievers, an in-group and an out-group. Typically, in religious systems, the in-group maintains purity, while the out-group is demonized as unclean. This brings to mind liberalism's checking of its own privilege and its demonization of those who do not bend the knee to their ideology. Every religion has its holy scriptures, and one could argue that liberalism boasts its own canon. The thinkers we have considered are among the prophets of a scholarly religion, ordered into an intellectual hierarchy. Because they worship society rather than God, their leading thinkers are sociologists rather than theologians. Marx is as revered by leftists for his social analysis as Augustine or Aquinas are revered for their scriptural exegesis. Gramsci, Sartre, and Foucault are like disciples, another tier of liberal saints. In fact, scholars have hailed Foucault as the patron saint of the LGBT movement. Beneath them are a network of academics, forming a sort of priesthood. They are mediators between society and the individual, interpreting scripture for the laity, bolstering their magical beliefs with affirmative chants, such as trans women are women or trans men are men. The human gods are speaking reality into existence. The priesthoods of academia have seized hold of social institutions. The state is, in a sense, their church. Like all leftists, they are statists. It is natural for worshippers of power. And as a consequence, liberalism has become a civic religion in the West. Religions have been known for periods of iconoclasm, the tearing down of icons and idols that offend the faith. Today, as liberalism grows in power, it grows in its desire to destroy the past. Statues of historic figures who have been deemed illiberal are torn down by the enraged mob. There is a progressive need to airbrush the past out of existence. The past is like a ball and chain that prevents them from moving into the future. As it was in the Cultural Revolution in the East, it is the same with the Cultural Revolution in the West, deconstructing the old and reconstructing the new. A key danger with materialist ideologies is that, unlike Christianity, they do not believe that the punishment of disbelievers happens in a supernatural afterlife. No, the sins of the antisocial must be punished in this life. Dissenters who do not comply with sacraments of the faith, such as raising the fist or taking the knee, are punished in liberal crusades. Their faith in the power of language to create reality gives them a deep fear of any speech that disagrees with the narrative. In short, hate speech is blasphemy, and as abominable to liberals as profaning the Lord's name is to Christians. Hate speech is any speech that challenges liberal orthodoxy. It must be eradicated. This has introduced an age of cancel culture, where infidels and apostates are pushed out of society. Not only can the academic priesthood and their institutional enforcers pursue blasphemers, But the internet has provided an unprecedented opportunity for millions of followers to participate in globalized inquisitions, a reach that medieval inquisitioners could never have even imagined. As followers of Christ speak of being born again, devotees of liberalism speak of being woke. Like the great Christian awakenings of American history, liberalism claims its own age of awakening. The woke enjoy an enlightened state of awareness, a heightened ability to perceive social injustice. The woke priesthood encourages confession among the in-group, encouraging followers of the faith to confess their sins of privilege and unconscious bias, and performative acts of self-flagellation. Like Christians, liberals have inherited the sins of their forebears. Of course, in liberalism, the sins are not spiritual, they are material, with whiteness becoming one of the cardinal sins, one which the sinner must publicly and sincerely denounce. Finally, there are grand displays of religious spectacle in liberalism. These are presented in cultural and political settings, the new temples of civil religion. The ritualized taking of the knee is a good example. Christians only kneel to God, an act of submission to the Supreme Being. But liberalism demands that we kneel to this other God, this social ideal. Following neo-Marxism's hugely successful cultural turn, liberal religious spectacles are screened around the world, with everyone present obligated to follow the rituals of the faith. From the sports field to the highest echelons of political power, having been emptied of God, they bend their knee to socialist ideologies. The list of religious comparisons could go on and on. So in dialectical fashion, I would like to finish with the differences between Christianity and liberalism. First, I would like to make a general claim about the religious category to which liberalism belongs. You could call it pagan Gnosticism. Pagan because its spirituality is grounded in the material, in nature, and it has a pantheon of deities, including its identitarian holy trinity of race, gender and sexuality. Gnostic because it is knowledge-based. Its devotees ascend on a ladder of sociological instruction, organised by a scholarly priesthood. The term pagan Gnosticism gives historical context to modern conflict between Christianity and liberalism, as the extension of conflict that began in antiquity. 2,000 years ago, early Christianity conflicted with the liberalism of its day, the Gnostic and pagan Greco-Roman culture of the ancient Mediterranean world. This too administered a progressive, inclusive social ideal that clashed with Christianity. Christ is pictured conquering the pagan gods. This ancient context merits a discussion of its own. For now, I would like to give two examples of difference between Christianity and liberalism. Firstly, Christianity is a sacrificial religion. Christ, the most powerful being to walk the earth, gave up that power, allowing himself to be killed by elites to save the people, killing himself to save others. Liberalism, on the other hand, is based on conquest. The people must seize power from elites, killing others to save themselves. Because of this, Christianity, in its ideal form, encourages a peaceful society, whereas liberalism encourages conflict. Secondly, Christianity is redemptive. Christ died for the sins of the world, reuniting believers with God. For Christians, Christ is the answer to dialectical conflict, which is a foundationally spiritual concern. Wherever Christ appears on the dialectical structure, the dialectic is finished. He is the only authentic synthesis. God sent the God-man to bridge the gap between God and man. No matter to which level the dialectic has unfolded, wherever Christ is present, the contradictions are complete. Liberalism, on the other hand, is non-redemptive. Having negated the redeeming sacrifice of God, liberalism makes endless human sacrifice for the ideal society. Liberalism is a religion of works. Its devotees must keep uncovering contradictions for the greater cause. They must answer the call of praxis from the priestly class. But as has been shown, there is no end to injustice. That Christianity is redemptive gives Christians a positive attitude towards life, in the sense that there is an answer to life's problems that is accessible to all. All power belongs to God, who gives his followers the blessed assurance of eternal life in a higher spiritual plane. That liberalism is non-redemptive gives liberals a negative view. All they can see is unjust abuse of earthly power, including, of course, Christian power. And the leftist must seize this power for themselves. They are their own salvation. This is why I frame these two religions as the path of salvation and the path of negation. Christianity is based on the salvation of existence, while liberalism is based on the negation of existence. The two are antithetical. The difference is made stark in the example of abortion. For the child in the womb, Christianity offers salvation, while liberalism offers negation. That there is a choice between two paths makes this a deeply moral conflict. The human must choose which way is better and which way is worse. Those on one path see the other side as being on the wrong path. And so the conflict continues.